Hey, and welcome back. As much as I enjoy doing projects for my own musical needs or amusement, I find it extremely rewarding when I can help a friend with one of their drums, and in today's video, I'll be bringing you along for a recent project I did for one of my friends, Ryan Thomas. Last year, I did a project refinishing and modifying a 16 by 10 children's bass drum, and after some time in my collection, that drum ended up in Ryan's possession. He mentioned to me that he was considering buying a Ludwig breakbeats kit or something similar, and I pitched my idea of taking a 16-inch floor tom that would match his current stage custom kit and cut that down and outfit it with all the hardware necessary to make a great bass drum. The stage custom drums are fantastic, and this would allow him to pick and choose which bass drum to use for whatever gig he might have. Of course, the biggest piece of the puzzle was buying the 16 by 15 floor tom shell, but aside from that, I reminded him he needed to consider wood hoops, claws, spurs, and a tom mount. Luckily, we found this damaged B-stock stage custom bass drum on Reverb, and it had pretty much all of those parts we'd need, except the correct size wood hoops. I'm sure this could have been done with cheaper parts, but honestly I thought it was worth using Yamaha parts wherever we could, with the hope of making this drum pass as a factory-built bass drum instead of a DIY conversion. Another bonus of buying this donor bass drum shell was the hope that we could use the lugs from that drum if the hole pattern matched, as plenty of bass drum lugs stick out a little further from the shell to account for the wider heads and hoops used on bass drums. So after getting everything downstairs and unboxed, we spent a bit of time measuring out the final depth we might like to cut this shell down to, along with some of the general placement for hardware. At this time, we were also able to confirm that the bass drum lugs from our donor shell would work with the same hole pattern on the tom shell, so that was a nice added bonus. Next, we began the process of stripping off all the lugs, mounts, and the badge attached to the tom shell before repeating the same process on the bass drum. I typically like to add painter's tape to the spot of the shell where I'm going to cut in order to prevent tear out on the saw, but since this drum was already finished with stain and lacquer, I went ahead and added tape around the entire outside of the shell with the hope that we wouldn't scratch any of it up as I rotated it on my table saw. It's a pain to do in the moment, but after making the mistake before on another drum, I've learned it's worth the extra time and all of the wasted tape. After masking the outside of the entire shell, we brought the drum upstairs and cut it down from a 15-inch depth to a 12-inch depth. I'm typically a big advocate of 14-inch depth bass drums, no matter how large or small the diameter is, but once it gets smaller than an 18, I feel that a 14-inch depth is just a little bit too big. Also, this is a size I've seen some iconic jazz drummers like Elvin Jones use. After we trimmed down the shell, we needed to add a new bearing edge to the fresh cut side. The factory edges appear to be some sort of double 45-degree cut, but I talked Ryan into letting me do a slight roundover on the outside, because I thought that would have a warmer, beefier tone for a bass drum. My router table setup is fine, but I don't have a great way to measure the exact depth of the cut, so typically I just do multiple passes, increasing the depth of the cut each time. This allows me to creep up on the desired profile, but also makes the cuts go a lot smoother because I'm only taking off a minimal amount of material in each pass. Once we had an edge that we liked, I was able to remove all of the tape, and it was right about this time where Ryan took off and left me on my own to finish the project. With the depth that we chose to cut, we cleared all the older lug holes, but there were 3 holes remaining in the shell that I wanted to plug from the original floor tom leg brackets. To fill in these holes, I typically like to use a dowel with a snug fit and glue them in place. Then I come back with a saw and trim them near flush to the shell, finally sanding them to get them just right. In this case, with the outside of the shell already being finished, I needed to get the fit and profile perfect before gluing them in, which was an added challenge. I also wanted to add some stain and finish them as close as I could to the dark red shell so they'd be unnoticeable from a few feet away. I went to my local hardware store and debated between some spray paint or stain, but honestly, in the end, I ended up actually stealing some of my wife's nail polish to get a real nice match and sheen to the shell. After that, I could go ahead and glue these plugs in place for good with some wood glue and let them dry for a while. After the glue had time to fully cure, I brought this drum back downstairs to begin drilling out for all of the lugs and hardware going on this shell. I added tape wherever I saw lug holes from the original side, and then used a carpenter's square along the bearing edge to transfer the placement to the fresh cut side. I checked for square a number of times with different tools and from the other edge just to make sure everything was lining up right, and then I decided to call it for the night. The next morning, I began by finding the distance from the edge for both holes, and then used a combination square to set a position that I could very easily just line up and quick copy to the other edge. After going around and doing this for all 8 lugs in 2 different spots, I then came back with a center punch to create a small divot on each mark so the bit wouldn't wander or drift at all when I came back with the drill. I find this to be an especially important step on a rounded surface like a drum shell, and it ensures a much more accurate hole placement. The first holes were real simple to do, going through the shell entirely, but on these Yamaha lugs, they use a very unique design where the second hole only goes about 1/8 of an inch of the way into the shell, allowing the lugs to be secured on with only 1 screw, but then the second hole is just acting as a guide to keep the lug from moving or pivoting on the shell. For this, I added some painter's tape on the drill bit so I'd know when to stop drilling. Once I had all the holes drilled out, I quickly went through and added the lugs back to the shell with the hope of everything fitting nicely. I did need to go back and widen up some of the holes a bit more because the bit I chose to use was just a bit too snug and required too much force to get everything to fit nicely, but after that, I could reattach these lugs and call it a day. I began the next morning by getting a placement and a few of the measurements for all the remaining hardware, beginning with the tom mount. I started by adding some tape to the general area I'd be drilling, and then I came back with a fabric tape measure to find the center point between the 2 lugs closest on the shell. This fabric tape measure has been a great purchase since it forms to the shape of the shell and has made my work like this way easier. Once I had the center line, I decided on a placement for the mount and began by drilling out the center tom arm hole with a hole saw. With the largest hole cut, I could then add the rubber gasket to the shell to use as a template for all the 4 mounting holes. I checked for square probably a dozen times and then came back in and drilled out all 4 of these holes, checking for square between each one of these holes being drilled. After I had all the holes for the tom mount drilled out, I could then go in and secure it in place for good with each of the 4 bolts and nuts, and then it was time to move on to the spurs. Spurs are always a challenge for me, but generally my strategy is to dry fit them in place and get a sense of where they can be mounted to give the resonant head some nice lift off the ground. It's tricky to do, and the size of the shell and amount of lugs really dictate where you can position these. Again, I used the gaskets as templates and checked for square so many times. One extra challenge with these spurs is that they require drilling at an angle not perpendicular to the shell, so after drilling out the holes initially, I had to come back through with the drill bit and create enough clearance for the spurs to fit in flush and comfortably. I've probably done 24 bass drum projects like this over the years, and spurs still remain the most tedious and nerve-wracking step, so I always have a big sigh of relief once everything works out and looks balanced. With all the hardware now back in place, my next step would usually be the most fun, adding some heads and hoops to finish the drum, but unfortunately, I needed to order some different tension rods because not only were the original tom rods too short, but the bass drum rods were too long, and even in my stock of tension rods, I couldn't find 16 of the right size. While I waited a few days for the tension rods to arrive, I decided to see if I could do anything with these extra parts left over from the tom shell. Since the cutoff portion of the shell still had both lug holes in place, and I had all of the tom lugs still lying around, I thought at the very least I'd be able to add these lugs back onto the cutoff and create some sort of pancake drum. While I was doing this, I also went ahead and added the floor tom legs back onto the shell, just using the single hole left from the cutoff, and honestly, this turned out to be a cute little drum. Now don't get me wrong, this drum doesn't sound great, but in the spirit of not wasting anything, it could at least end up as an end table or something functional like that. After a few more days of waiting, the tension rods finally arrived, and I could get to adding the heads and hoops back on this shell and get this drum fully assembled. These rods were the perfect length and avoided any splay where they would go in at too steep of an angle, creating unnecessary friction. Ryan and I planned out pretty much every part of this project, and I'd been sending him pictures along the way, so he had seen how good everything was coming out but I decided I wanted to surprise him with one last part of this project, the front kick head. I removed the giant Aquarian logo with some goof off, and then added this decal I had bought off Etsy with a vintage Yamaha script logo. I'm a big fan of ordering decals like this because they're a lot cheaper than logo heads, and you can also do more unique things like this that don't really exist on the market. With both heads now on, I could bring this drum over into the studio and set it up along with Ryan's 2 toms that he let me borrow so I could record a demo for you guys. For this recording, I decided on using a simple 2 microphone setup with an SE Electronics V-Kick on the bass drum and a Shure KSM32 as a mono overhead. I tried to showcase the range with 2 different tunings and minimal EQ and processing, but before you come raging at me in the comments about how the low tuning isn't that low, just factor in that we're working with a 16-inch bass drum here. As you can hear, this drum has some serious versatility for being such a small shell. Of course, it's a bit limited in low-end punch, but I think if you were willing to bring this out on a gig where you might mic it up, you could add enough low-end with processing to get a workable sound for most styles. On the higher end, it sings beautifully for styles like jazz and hip-hop, and reminded me a ton of the Questlove sound. Maybe more impressive than the quality and variety of sounds coming from this drum though, is the look. This drum is seemingly a perfect match for these toms, and in my opinion, looks like a factory-built bass drum and not a DIY project. I really consider this drum some of my finest work, and I loved getting to do one of these tom to kit conversions at this level, in contrast to some of the others I've done in the past, where I've either avoided drilling and making permanent changes, or did things on a budget and tried to spend as little as possible. I'm sure there are going to be viewers of this video who add up the price of all the various parts we purchased to make this bass drum, and argue that we could have bought something like a Breakbeats kit for almost the same price, but in my opinion, This drum is of a higher build quality and is a bit of a different design than those other options on the market. As much as I'm proud of this drum personally, I was even more eager to see what Ryan thought, so I decided to try and capture a bit of that grand reveal moment. As you can see, he was certainly excited about how it turned out and didn't waste too much time before sitting down and playing it. After a bit of time letting him give it a test run, we packed everything up so he could take it with him, but I did surprise Ryan with one final piece, the scrap pancake floor tom. I'm not sure he'll find this nearly as useful as the bass drum, but he did get a good laugh out of it, and I told him I better see him try to use it on a gig at some point down the road. I'd love to hear what you guys think about this project, so leave a comment down below letting me know if this is something you'd ever invest in. If it's not your cup of tea, I have a few videos with similar projects like this on my channel, either done on more of a budget, or done with parts that don't permanently alter the shell or require any drilling. If you enjoyed this video, make sure to give it a thumbs up and subscribe to my channel to stay up to date on all of my future video releases, and until next time, thanks.